You never quite know how your day is going to go in boating. Some days, there'll be chill days like the boat's name says. Other days will be a little more chaotic, kind of like this scene here over in Redondo Beach, California, where this boat was being towed up a hill when all of a sudden the towing vehicle wound up losing power and rolling backwards down the hill. Fortunately, they were actually saved by the telephone pole you see in the images, but just one of the wild and crazy things we'll witness in this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to Brazil, where this was the scene just a little over a week ago. Here in the images, you're going to see the vessel, the Norman Flowers, a large offshore support vessel coming into Newport, when all of a sudden the vessel, for whatever reason, as it's backing in, winds up crashing into the quay, stern first.
Largou o ferro, já era, bateu, vai bater. Caraca, maluco, deu ruim, olha lá. Eita, que isso, brother.
Here you can see as the collision occurs, the vessel winds up coming in a little too hot, causing damage to the concrete seawall at the port, but also taking damage itself. Here we can see water evacuating from the port side stern of the vessel. Fortunately, in this situation, no injuries were reported and the vessel was able to stay afloat, but no further information has been released at this time as to the actual cause of the incident. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to Fort Lauderdale and touch on a story we actually already talked about a few weeks ago. This is one of those water jet cars, and it's actually floating around near where the Fort Lauderdale boat show is going on. Now, you may remember a few weeks back, we actually touched on this same story. One of these water jet cars wound up capsizing and sinking over near where the ferry dock was during the boat show. The images we had then were from other vessels already showing the capsized vehicle. Shortly after that, these videos came out showing how we actually led to that scene. Here you can see the vessel is hanging out right next to the dock where the ferry is that actually runs people from the convention center over to Bahia Mar Marina at the Fort Lauderdale boat show. And as you can see from these images, things don't look right. The vessel is sitting extremely low in the water, and right there for a moment it actually appears that it had lost power and was drifting backwards, but here you can really see it as they're trying to move forward, and the bow of this thing is basically just plowing and digging under the water, but you can tell the instability of it as well, which means they've already taken on a ton of water, and as they move around, the water is shifting in the hull, making the vessel itself unstable. Fortunately, in this situation, there were plenty of local vessels around, and they were able to get the 3 people off the boat, but it did eventually wind up capsizing. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to South Korea, where this was the scene just a little over a week ago as well, when the 26,000-ton ferry Queen Genovia II was traveling from Jeju Island over to Mokpo with approximately 267 passengers and 21 crew on board, when all of a sudden the vessel wound up having an issue as it turned into a narrow channel. According to a Coast Guard official, they claimed the ferry had become stuck and struck a rocky island near Jindo. Several passengers were interviewed. They claimed they heard a loud bang in the middle of the night, causing mass panic and confusion on board the ferry as the ferry wound up coming to a complete stop. Footage that's been released from the incident shows passengers wearing life jackets awaiting to be transferred to rescue boats. The vessel's bow appears to be stuck in the edge of the small island, but fortunately in this situation, as you can see in the images, the vessel is sitting upright. It doesn't appear to be in any danger of sinking, and most of the crew and passengers all appear to be calm as rescue vessels do show up to wind up rescuing the 267 passengers off of the boat. 21 crew members did decide to stay on board the vessel as they did plan to try and move this vessel off the island and bring it back into port. Also, fortunately in this situation, no major injuries were reported. The Coast Guard has launched an investigation to try and determine what exactly went wrong and how the ferry itself wound up crashing into the island. The incident occurred in a very narrow channel, and it does appear at the time of the incident, the ferry was still on autopilot, which they claim is a little unusual. Due to the technical difficulties of trying to navigate this channel, typically most vessels would actually turn that autopilot off before entering the channel, and for some reason, this crew did not, and the Coast Guard's still trying to figure out why.
Further investigation is required. However, at this time, we preliminarily assess it to be due to negligence by the captain or the navigating officer.
More information since this incident occurred has been released, and several officers from on board this vessel actually have been arrested due to possible negligence, and it is claimed that possibly the person who was navigating the vessel at the time was on the phone instead of paying attention to what was going on. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to Washington State, where this was the scene just a little over a week ago when the U.S. Coast Guard says a crabbing boat crew helped save 4 people off of a fishing vessel in the Pacific Ocean. According to the Coast Guard, the crew of the Abbey Sea called for help around 8 a.m., saying their vessel was sinking and taking on water. Fortunately, the crew on board a different vessel wound up hearing this call. The vessel was the Lady Nancy, which was only a couple of miles away from the spot identified in the emergency call at the time, and quickly made their way to the location that was identified. After the Lady Nancy's crew wound up arriving on the scene, they quickly went into position and began conducting a grid search for approximately 20 minutes when all of a sudden one of the crew members off in the distance wound up spotting an orange life raft. The Lady Nancy quickly approached the raft. Upon approaching, they spotted 4 men, 2 who were in the raft and 2 who were clinging onto a survival suit in the water. The rescue became critical when one of the people who was in the water began to lose consciousness and started to sink. Fortunately, one of the crew members on board the Lady Nancy had already donned a survival suit and was able to quickly jump into the water and pull the man on board the vessel. The crew wound up giving him CPR and actually bringing him back to life. The Coast Guard arrived shortly afterwards and wound up transporting the 4 crew members back to shore, with all 4 wound up surviving the ordeal thanks to the quick work of the Lady Nancy showing up and able to pull them from the cold Pacific waters. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to Turkey, where this was the scene just this past week, when blasts wound up striking 2 tankers from Russia's Shadow Fleet in the Black Sea, near Turkey's Bosphorus Strait. Both vessels are sanctioned vessels believed to be a part of Russia's Shadow Fleet. The first vessel was the 274-meter-long Karos, which wound up suffering an explosion approximately 28 miles offshore, requiring assistance to get the crew off the ship. Not very long after the first incident, another tanker called the Virat was apparently struck as well, approximately 35 miles off the coast, also requiring assistance to get the crew off the vessel. Fortunately, in both these situations, both crews were safely rescued from the ships. This is an interesting story though, because initial reports claimed it was believed that possibly the ships may have hit a mine in the Black Sea, and Ukrainian officials quickly, in the first reports I saw, denied having anything to do with the incidents, claiming there was no real positive benefit for them in actually doing anything to harm these vessels. But it didn't take long, and that story wound up changing, as footage wound up surfacing showing waterborne drones speeding through the water, rushing towards these tankers just before the explosion occurred, leaving the Ukraine no choice but to admit that Ukrainian naval drones had actually hit the 2 oil tankers. But fortunately in this situation, the crews from both tankers, as we mentioned, were rescued safely. Thanks for watching, crew. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening out on your waterways, be sure to hit us up on Facebook or Instagram at Broncos Guru and let us know when you might see your stories over here. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button. If not, we're coming to steal your drain plug.